The static on the radio had been constant for 3 hours. Sergeant Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead, squinting through the dust that seemed to live in the Afghan air. In Morrison's left pocket sat a drawing Morrison's daughter had made 2 months ago. A stick-figure soldier holding a heart. That paper was more worn than Morrison's boots. What Morrison didn't know was that in exactly 17 minutes, a single radio transmission would force Morrison to choose between saving a life and following orders. And the voice Morrison would hear would belong to someone the Army had declared dead 6 months ago. The Helmand province stretched endlessly, a maze of mud walls and hidden dangers. Morrison's platoon moved through the narrow streets of a village that didn't exist on their maps. Lieutenant Blake walked point, Blake's movements cautious but confident. Behind them, Corporal Harris kept checking his watch. Harris's wife was due to give birth any day, and the not knowing was eating Harris alive. Specialist Thompson hummed quietly, a habit that annoyed everyone but somehow kept them sane. They were brothers bound by sand and fear. Trust built in a place where trust could get you killed. The mission was simple. Secure the village. Question the locals. Move on. Standard patrol protocol the platoon had done 100 times. But Morrison felt it in Morrison's gut, that familiar electric tension that meant something was wrong. Morrison had learned to trust that feeling during Morrison's second tour in Iraq. The village was too quiet. No children playing, no women at the wells. Even the dogs had disappeared. Blake raised Blake's fist. Everyone froze. Through the scope, Morrison saw it. A door slightly ajar in a compound that should have been empty. Intel had said this village was civilian only, no Taliban presence for months. But Intel had been wrong before. Blake signaled 2 fingers toward Thompson and Harris. The 2 soldiers moved like shadows, weapons ready, every sense screaming. The radio crackled. Morrison almost ignored it. Probably just command checking in. But something made Morrison answer. The voice that came through made Morrison's blood turn cold. Raspy, damaged, familiar. The voice said Morrison's name. Not Morrison's rank. Morrison's actual name. Jake. The way Morrison's mother said it. The way Morrison's daughter tried to pronounce it. And then the voice said something impossible. The voice gave Morrison coordinates. Coordinates inside this very village. And the voice said one word that changed everything. Trap. Morrison's hand shot up. Stop, everyone, now. Blake turned, confusion flooding Blake's eyes. Thompson and Harris were already at the door. Too late to call them back without shouting. Morrison's mind raced. That voice. Morrison knew that voice. But it couldn't be. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had died in a convoy attack outside Kandahar 6 months ago. Morrison had seen the flag-draped casket. Morrison had stood at attention while Webb's mother cried. The Army doesn't make mistakes about deaths. They don't. The explosion ripped through the afternoon silence like God's own thunder. Morrison hit the ground, ears ringing, dust choking Morrison's lungs. When Morrison could see again, the building Thompson and Harris had approached was gone. Just gone. Replaced by smoke and rubble and the kind of silence that comes after violence. Blake was screaming into Blake's radio. Morrison couldn't hear the words. Just saw Blake's mouth moving, saw the panic in movements that were never supposed to panic. Morrison looked at Morrison's own radio. Still crackling, still transmitting. And through the static came that voice again. Weaker now, broken. The voice said to Morrison, I tried to warn you. I tried. Get out. They know you're coming. They've always known. Morrison transmitted back. Morrison's voice steadier than Morrison's hands. Who is this? Tell me who you are. The response took 10 seconds. 10 seconds where Morrison's world hung suspended. 10 seconds where Morrison could hear Blake organizing evacuation, could hear the moans from the rubble where Thompson and Harris were buried, could hear Morrison's own heartbeat drowning out everything else. The voice responded, You know who I am, Jake. And you know what they did to us. What they're still doing. This war isn't what they told us. It never was. Morrison's training said, Ignore it. Secure the wounded. Follow protocol. But something deeper, something human, made Morrison ask the question. Morrison transmitted, "Where are you?" The coordinates came through. A building 300 meters north. Alone. Morrison looked at Blake, who was directing 2 privates toward the rubble. Morrison looked at the village, at the empty streets that suddenly made terrible sense. Morrison looked at the radio in Morrison's hand, at the impossible choice forming in front of Morrison. Standard operating procedure said, stay with your unit, never separate, never go dark. But that voice, that impossible voice, if there was even a chance Webb was alive, if there was even a chance this went deeper than a Taliban ambush, Morrison had to know. Morrison had to. Blake caught Morrison's eye. Morrison made a decision that would define everything that came after. Morrison pointed north, held up 3 fingers. 3 minutes. Blake's face showed everything: anger, fear, understanding, resignation. 3 minutes. Not a second more. Morrison moved through the village alone. Every shadow was a threat. Every window a potential kill shot. The building matched the coordinates perfectly. A small compound. Walls pockmarked with old bullet holes. A blue door hanging crooked on its hinges. Morrison checked Morrison's weapon. Checked Morrison's corners, pushed the door open. The smell hit Morrison first. Blood. Infection. Human suffering. The room was dark except for a shaft of light through a cracked ceiling. And in that light, slumped against the far wall, was something that used to be a man. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, covered in scars that looked surgical. But the face. God, the face. Even destroyed, even wrong, Morrison knew that face. Webb. The man's lips moved. Webb said to Morrison, "Took you long enough?" Webb's voice was the radio voice, damaged and raw. Morrison knelt beside Webb, Morrison's mind trying to process what Morrison's eyes were seeing. The convoy attack, the funeral, the death certificate, all of it crashing against the reality of Marcus Webb breathing, barely, in front of Morrison. Morrison whispered to Webb, "What happened to you?" Webb's laugh was broken glass. Webb said, "What happened? They happened, Jake. Our own people. Not Taliban. Not insurgents. Us." Webb's hand lifted weakly, pointing to scars that weren't from combat. Webb continued, "They wanted information about villages we'd secured, supply routes we'd established, patterns we'd noticed. And when I wouldn't talk, they made sure no one would ever find me. Declared me KI, neat, clean, no questions." Morrison's world tilted. This wasn't possible. American soldiers didn't disappear their own, didn't torture for intel, didn't fake deaths. But Webb's scars didn't lie. The desperation in Webb's eyes didn't lie. And suddenly Morrison understood why the village was empty, why intel was wrong, why that door had been left open. Someone wanted this meeting to happen. Someone wanted Morrison to find Webb, or someone wanted both of them dead. The radio on Morrison's vest erupted. Blake's voice, urgent and afraid, came through. Blake said, "Jake, we've got movement. Multiple positions. We're surrounded. Get back here now." Morrison looked at Webb, at Morrison's brother, who'd been erased, at the truth that could destroy everything or save nothing. Morrison had seconds to decide. Drag Webb back to the platoon, expose whatever conspiracy had done this, risk everyone's life in the process. Or leave Webb here, get Morrison's men to safety. Let the darkness keep its secrets. Webb's hand gripped Morrison's arm with surprising strength. Webb said to Morrison, "Don't be stupid. Save your men. I'm already dead. Have been for months. But Jake," Webb pulled Morrison closer, "when you get home, find my wife. Tell her I never stopped thinking about her. Tell her the army lied. Promise me." Morrison's throat closed. The radio screamed again. Gunfire erupted outside. Close. Too close. Blake was yelling coordinates, calling for air support, holding a position that wouldn't hold. Morrison had 10 seconds. Maybe less. Morrison looked at the drawing in Morrison's pocket. At Morrison's daughter's stick figure soldier holding a heart. Morrison thought about Harris's unborn child, about Thompson's stupid humming, about Blake's unshakable belief in doing the right thing, about Webb's wife who'd buried an empty casket, about every choice that had led to this moment in this room, in this godforsaken war. Morrison stood. Webb's eyes followed Morrison. No judgment, just understanding, just the tired acceptance of a man who'd already died once. Morrison moved to the door, weapon ready. Morrison stopped. Morrison turned back. Morrison said to Webb, "I'll find her. I promise." Webb nodded. Webb closed Webb's eyes. Morrison ran. The street outside was chaos. Tracer rounds cut through dust. Blake's platoon had formed a defensive position behind a crumbling wall. Morrison counted bodies. Everyone was there, bloodied but alive. Even Thompson and Harris, pulled from the rubble, battered but breathing. Blake saw Morrison, and relief flooded Blake's face before anger replaced it. Blake shouted over the gunfire to Morrison, "Where the hell were you?" Morrison took position, returned fire toward muzzle flashes and windows across the street. Morrison's mind was split. Half here, fighting for survival. Half back in that dark room with a ghost who was real. The radio on Morrison's vest crackled. That voice again. Webb's voice. Weaker now, fading. Webb's voice said, "Northeast corner, second building, RPG team, 30 seconds. Morrison didn't hesitate. Morrison shouted to Blake, "Blake, northeast corner, second building, RPG incoming, 30 seconds. Blake's head snapped around. Blake asked Morrison, "How do you know that?" Morrison said to Blake, "Just trust me." Blake's training warred with Blake's instinct. Training won. Blake redirected fire. Blake called the target. 20 seconds later, the building erupted as their rounds found the RPG team. The explosion lit up the afternoon. The enemy fire slackened. Confusion in their ranks. Their ambush was failing. Morrison's radio crackled again. Webb's voice said, "West wall, breach point. They'll try to flank. 2 minutes." Morrison relayed it to Blake. Blake didn't question this time. Blake repositioned Blake's men. Blake reinforced the weak point. When the enemy pushed through exactly where Webb said they would, they ran into a wall of coordinated fire. The ambush collapsed. Whoever planned this hadn't counted on inside information. Hadn't counted on a dead man saving his brothers one last time. The firefight lasted another 7 minutes. Then silence. Real silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of aftermath. Blake's platoon held. 3 wounded, none critical. Thompson was unconscious, but stable. Harris had a piece of shrapnel in Harris's shoulder, but was already joking about the Purple Heart. Miracles built on impossible radio calls. Blake approached Morrison while the medics worked. Blake's face was stone. Blake's eyes were questions Morrison couldn't answer. Not here. Not now. Maybe not ever. Blake asked Morrison quietly, "Where did that intel come from?" Morrison looked north, toward the building with the blue door, toward Webb, toward secrets that would die with both of them. Morrison said to Blake, "A good guess." Blake studied Morrison, a lieutenant who'd learned to read men in the space between bullets. Blake knew Morrison was lying. Blake knew something had happened during those 3 minutes. Blake knew it was big enough to save their lives, big enough to bury. Blake said to Morrison, "We're going to talk about this. When we get back, all of it." Morrison nodded, knowing they wouldn't. Knowing Blake understood that some truths were too dangerous to speak. The kind that got men disappeared. The kind that turned heroes into casualties of friendly fire. The kind that made soldiers into ghosts. The extraction helicopters arrived 20 minutes later. Blackhawks thundering through the valley, downdraft kicking up storms of sand. The wounded loaded first, then the walking. Morrison was last, standing on Afghan soil, staring at that blue door 300 meters away, wondering if Webb was still alive, wondering if leaving Webb was mercy or cowardice, wondering if the promise Morrison had made was something Morrison could keep or something that would destroy Morrison trying. The helicopter lifted. The village became small. The building became invisible. Morrison's hand went to Morrison's pocket, to the drawing, to the stick figure soldier holding a heart. Morrison's daughter had written words at the bottom in crayon. "Come home safe, Daddy." Morrison closed Morrison's eyes. Safe. What did that even mean anymore? Safe from bullets and bombs, maybe, but not safe from memories. Not safe from the weight of choices. Not safe from the voice on the radio that should have been dead, but wasn't. Not safe from the promise. 3 weeks later, Morrison stood on American soil. Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The air smelled like grass and normalcy and lies. Morrison's daughter ran to Morrison at the airport, threw herself into Morrison's arms with the complete trust children have before the world teaches them fear. Morrison's wife cried and smiled, and didn't ask about the shadows in Morrison's eyes. Not yet. That conversation would come. They always did. But first, Morrison had a different conversation to have, a promise to keep. Morrison had found the address through official channels. Webb's widow lived in a small town in North Carolina. White picket fence. Garden in the front yard. The American dream wrapped around a gold star wife's nightmare. Morrison stood on her porch for 5 minutes before knocking, rehearsing words that wouldn't come, preparing for questions Morrison couldn't answer. She opened the door. Younger than Morrison expected. Blonde hair pulled back, eyes that had cried all their tears months ago and now just held emptiness. She looked at Morrison's uniform, at the rank that said Morrison had served with her husband, at the expression that said Morrison had news. News the Army hadn't given her. News that would change everything or nothing. Morrison began, Morrison's voice cracking. "Mrs. Webb, my name is Jake Morrison. I served with your husband. I need to talk to you about Marcus." She stood very still. The color drained from her face. Her hand gripped the doorframe. She knew, somehow she knew, that what Morrison was about to say would hurt worse than the casualty notification officers who'd come to this same door 6 months ago. Hurt worse because it would give her hope, and hope was crueler than grief. Morrison said to her, "He's alive, or he was. 3 weeks ago, in Afghanistan." Her knees buckled. Morrison caught her. Morrison helped her to a chair inside. Morrison sat across from her while she processed the impossible, while tears came, while anger came, while 1,000 questions Morrison couldn't fully answer crashed over both of them. Morrison told her what Morrison could, that Webb had been taken, held, tortured, erased, that Morrison had found Webb in a village that shouldn't have existed, that Webb had saved Morrison's entire platoon with Webb's last strength, that Webb had asked Morrison to deliver a message, that Webb had never stopped thinking about her, that the Army had lied. What Morrison didn't tell her was the part that kept Morrison awake at night, that Morrison had left Webb there, that Morrison had chosen Morrison's men over Morrison's brother, that Morrison didn't know if Webb had survived another hour or another day, or if Webb had died alone in that dark room waiting for rescue that never came. Some truths were too heavy to share. Some guilt was too personal to split. Mrs. Webb listened, cried, asked questions Morrison answered as honestly as Morrison could, without revealing operational details that would get them both killed. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, stronger than Morrison expected. She asked Morrison, "Is he still alive?" Morrison met her eyes. Morrison said to her, "I don't know. I tried to find out. Went through channels, asked questions, but the Army says there's no record, no building, no village, no Marcus Webb beyond the KIA report. It's like that day never happened." She said to Morrison, "But you know it did." Morrison said, "I know it did." She nodded slowly, processing, planning. Morrison recognized that look. Morrison had seen it in soldiers who decided to fight regardless of orders. She wasn't going to let this go, wasn't going to accept the official story, and Morrison knew that would get her labeled. Conspiracy theorist, delusional widow, threat to operational security. Morrison said carefully to Mrs. Webb, "Mrs. Webb, you need to be smart about this. Whoever did this to Marcus, they're powerful, they're protected, and they've already killed him once. If you push too hard, ask too many questions. She interrupted Morrison. I don't care. He's my husband. If there's any chance he's alive, I'm going to find him. Morrison understood. Would have done the same. Was doing the same, in Morrison's own way. Digging quietly. Following threads, building a file of inconsistencies and impossibilities. Knowing it would probably lead nowhere. Knowing Morrison had to try. Morrison gave her a number. Untraceable phone. Encrypted. Morrison told her to call if she found anything or if anything found her. Morrison made her promise to be careful. To trust no one in uniform. To assume every conversation was monitored and every move was watched. Because in Morrison's gut, Morrison knew this was bigger than one disappeared soldier. Bigger than one ambush. Bigger than Morrison wanted to imagine. 3 months passed. Morrison tried to return to normal. Family dinners. Morrison's daughter's soccer games. Movie nights with Morrison's wife. The rhythms of civilian life wrapped around a soldier's heart. But normal was a lie. Every night, Morrison dreamed of that blue door. Every morning, Morrison checked the encrypted phone. Every day, Morrison wondered if Morrison had done enough. If Morrison had done anything that mattered. Then the phone rang. Mrs. Webb's voice was different. Excited. Terrified. She told Morrison she'd found something. Documents, medical records, facility transfers that didn't make sense. Money trails that led to private contractors, names that connected to black sites and enhanced interrogation and programs that officially didn't exist. She told Morrison she'd found proof that Marcus wasn't the only one, that soldiers were being disappeared, experimented on, used. Morrison listened. Morrison's blood turning cold. Morrison's worst fears confirmed and exceeded. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was systematic. Institutional, protected at the highest levels. And now Mrs. Webb had stumbled into the middle of it, had made herself a target, had maybe hours before they came for her. Morrison said to her, "You need to run. Right now. Don't pack. Don't call anyone. Just go." She said to Morrison, "I can't. Jake, this is bigger than Marcus, bigger than us. Someone has to." The line went dead. Morrison tried calling back. Nothing. Morrison tried the backup number. Nothing. Morrison grabbed Morrison's keys. Morrison threw himself into Morrison's car. North Carolina was an 8-hour drive. Morrison made it in 6. Morrison ran every red light. Morrison broke every speed limit. Morrison prayed to a God. Morrison wasn't sure Morrison believed in any more that Morrison wasn't too late. The house looked normal. Lights on. Car in the driveway. Garden undisturbed. Morrison approached carefully. Every sense screaming the way it had in that Afghan village. The front door was unlocked. That was wrong. Mrs. Webb was too smart to leave it unlocked, too careful after everything. Morrison pushed inside. The house was clean. Too clean. Professionally clean. The kind of clean that erases evidence. Mrs. Webb's laptop was gone. Her files were gone. Her phone was gone. And in the middle of the kitchen table sat a single photograph. Marcus Webb in uniform. Smiling, young, alive. Beneath it, handwritten in block letters, "Let the dead rest." Morrison stood in that empty house and felt the weight of every choice collapse on Morrison. Morrison had kept Morrison's promise, told her the truth, given her hope, and that hope had gotten her disappeared the same way it had gotten Marcus disappeared. The same way it would get Morrison disappeared if Morrison didn't walk away right now. If Morrison didn't let the dead rest. Morrison took the photograph. Morrison walked out. Morrison got in Morrison's car. Morrison drove home through the night with tears running down Morrison's face and rage burning holes in Morrison's chest. Morrison arrived at dawn. Morrison's wife was awake, worried, asking questions. Morrison's daughter ran to Morrison with that complete trust, that innocence, that belief that Daddy could fix anything. Morrison held them both. Morrison made a choice, the hardest choice. Morrison would let the dead rest, would stop digging, would be the husband and father they needed, would carry the weight alone, would live with knowing that somewhere, soldiers were being erased and Morrison was doing nothing. That Mrs. Webb was gone and Morrison had led her there. That Marcus Webb had saved Morrison's life and Morrison had abandoned Webb to darkness. But Morrison kept the photograph, and the encrypted phone, and the file of inconsistencies. Because Morrison knew something else. Knew it with the same certainty that had made Morrison trust that feeling in the Afghan village. This wasn't over. Not really. The dead don't rest. They wait. And someday, somehow, the truth would surface. The disappeared would be found. The lies would crumble. Morrison just hoped Morrison would be alive to see it, and strong enough to face what it would cost. Morrison looked at Morrison's daughter, at her innocent smile, at the stick figure soldier she'd drawn, holding a heart, and Morrison understood the final, terrible truth, that being a soldier wasn't about wearing a uniform or following orders or serving your country. It was about carrying impossible weights, making unbearable choices, living with the consequences of both. Morrison had made Morrison's choice. Morrison would live with it, every day, every nightmare. Every time Morrison looked in the mirror and saw the ghost of Marcus Webb staring back. Every time Morrison held Morrison's daughter and wondered what kind of man she would think Morrison was if she knew the truth. But for now, Morrison would be daddy, would be husband, would be the man who came home safe, even though safe was the biggest lie of all. Because the war didn't end when the soldier left the battlefield. It just followed them home, took up residence in the spaces between heartbeats, whispered through static on radios that weren't even turned on. And sometimes, late at night, when Morrison's family slept and the house was quiet, Morrison would take out that photograph, would look at Marcus Webb's smile, would listen for that impossible voice on a phone that never rang, would wait for the dead to speak again. Because Morrison knew they would. The dead always do, eventually.